Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove. I'm here today with another Omnibus review. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the X-Men by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee Omnibus Volume 2. Now I have talked about Volume 1 previously on the channel, but it was a little while ago now, so I thought it was about time that I got on to talking about Volume 2. So I'm going to take a look through the book, give an overview, a discussion, let's talk about some story points, and give my overall thoughts. So if we take a look at the DM cover here, first of all, this is the cover with the horizontal image. It's actually the image from the cover of Uncanny X-Men 275, just recoloured in a more modern way. I think it looks really nice. It matches the DM cover to Volume 1 really well, so when you've got the two of those with this cover, or rather the DM cover each, it does look like a pretty cool matching set in my opinion. On the spine, pretty straightforward, just X-Men, and we've got Chris Claremont, Jim Lee, Will Spatasio, and this image at the bottom, which I think is a Jim Lee image from the Scattershot trade paperback cover, or from promotional image. Something that's not actually in this book, interestingly enough. But yeah, I think it's a different cover on the standard variant. I think it's Magneto. Anyway, then on the back we've got the cover gallery. So all the issues involved, you know, your pretty standard Marvel Omnibus thing. You see that most of the time. And the contents down there at the bottom. You're actually getting a mixture of X-Factor and Uncanny X-Men issues in here prior to seeing the X-Men series itself get launched. So we've got X-Factor 63 to 70, Uncanny X-Men 273 to 280, and then X-Men 1 to 9 and material from 10 to 11, plus a couple of Ghost Rider crossover issues. And there's a lot of good stuff in here. I think a lot of people prefer this book, or the contents of this book rather, to the first volume. I think objectively this stuff in here is more exciting. There's more sort of action sequences, and maybe more importantly to a lot of people, more actual Jim Lee artwork, whereas there isn't a lot of that in the first volume. It's mostly Mark Silvestri artwork, despite the title of the book. But in here we're seeing a fair amount of Jim Lee. So Chris Claremont still the main writer in here, along with Louise Simonson on the X-Factor issues. We're seeing Will Spatasio artwork on those X-Factor issues as well. So the art kind of evenly split overall, I'd say, between Lee and Spatasio. Contents page here, pretty standard stuff, as well as a fairly lengthy recap for anybody who is jumping into this book, I suppose, without having read any of the other stuff that came before it. I would not recommend you do that. It's a lot of catching up to do if you do that. This gives you a good idea of what's going on, I suppose, but not the ideal way to do it. So then we jump into X-Factor 63. Now the main thing that ends up happening during this run of X-Factor issues ends up being a pretty awesome encounter with Apocalypse. So I suppose I need to give a spoiler warning right now before I go any further, even though I won't be discussing all the plot points in this book, because, you know, I'm just never going to get around to doing that for any omnibus, really. There's just too much to talk about, but I will certainly discuss some key points and maybe some stuff you don't want to know about if you've never read this before. So, you know, fair warning there. So this is all taking place, though, just for a bit of context, in between volumes 1 and 2, these omnibus editions. There was the Extinction Agenda event, which is not collected at all in either of these books, and this previously released as a oversized hardcover that is, I think, long out of print now. I don't have the oversized hardcover, I've got it just in a trade paperback. But yeah, so you just need to be aware that, I suppose, between these two, that does happen. Not that I think it is directly referenced a whole lot in this particular book. But yeah, the Extinction Agenda event having been, just to very quickly summarise that, an event that took place on the island nation of Genosha, which was a severely and extremely anti-mutant regime. The New Mutants, X-Men and X-Factor all got involved there. There was a huge fight with an evil guy. And yeah, finally they managed to win the day, and here they are. And so we start to see the teams heading towards reuniting. So for a long time up to this point, the X-Men and X-Factor, which was made up of the original X-Men team from the Silver Age days, had been operating separately to each other. And finally, you know, we get to a point by the end of the Uncanny and X-Factor issues in here where they finally get back together again. And along the way, we get a good amount of Jim Lee artwork this time around, which, as a Jim Lee fan, is always great to see. But these are just really exciting issues, I think. You know, really cool stories going in here. This is ultimately the concluding chapter to Chris Claremont's run, his very lengthy 16-year run from 75 to 91. This issue is just excellent. I mean, the cover there, 274, just top quality Jim Lee cover, really like that. We got Rogue in her classic Savage Land outfit, if you can really call that an outfit. It just about qualifies, I suppose. But yeah, really good stuff. This is also where, sadly for me, you know, we see Magneto, after a lengthy stint of having been a kind of reformed villain. He'd been playing the good guy for a while. He'd been looking after the New Mutants in Xavier's stead whilst he was away. But here we see him revert back to being a villain. And it's handled pretty well. You know, as much as I didn't really like that. I thought it was quite interesting that whilst he was a good guy. So to just kind of see him go back to being a villain again was a little bit disappointing, but I suppose it was always going to happen. But he's had this really interesting relationship going on, like almost slightly romantic relationship with Rogue. They had a bit of a bond that they developed with their time together in the Savage Land. So it's, you know, she's kind of desperately pleading with him in the end to not to do it, not to go back to being who he was. Here's that double cover for 275 used on the cover for the Omnibus. These are the original colours. Really cool that they keep the cover format, you know, spread across 2 pages in here. I think that's really good. But yeah, so yeah, it ends up being a little bit heartbreaking in a way. You know, certainly very sad. This artwork in here, this Jim Lee stuff, really, really good. This is the storyline where finally the X-Men go and retrieve Professor Xavier, who had been away for so long. He'd been away since, I think, around issue 200. So finally here, 75 issues later, the X-Men go and find him in space. He'd been with the Shi'ar fleet with the Empress Lilandra, the alien emperor who he happens to be in love with. Yeah, so this is a space adventure. Got very strong sci-fi vibes. I mean, it's cutting back and forth between the X-Men in space and this story with Rogue and Magneto in the Savage Land. It's actually really exciting stuff. You know, by this point, it's got kind of a summer blockbuster feel to it, this particular story arc. I can see, you know, certainly just on surface level why people enjoy this stuff more than the material in Volume 1, the Claremont Lee Omnibus, because the stuff in there is very much a slow build. You know, it was Claremont being classic Claremont, really, just kind of playing the long game with his storytelling, story building, and kind of working towards this, really. So, you know, there's a lot of build-up that went into all this stuff. And this is like everything finally culminating in a big, exciting conclusion, which is helped enormously by the Jim Lee artwork, who, you know, he just gives this such a... I wouldn't even say he's the best X-Men artist. You know, I know some people probably would say that. I don't think he is, but undeniably, his artwork just has this really dynamic look to it. It's got something inherently exciting about it that makes this storyline, and really any of the storylines he draws, or drew rather, yeah, just look really appealing. You know, they just look more exciting. They're big and bold, but without being too extreme, which was, you know, the trap that many artists during this time fell into. You know, Liefeld, for example. Yeah, he had enough quality about his artwork that it manages to look both, you know, big and bold and exciting, but still have a quality to it. I mean, that's hopefully a description that makes some sense. I don't know, but basically, yeah, it looks 90s to me without being too 90s, I suppose, maybe. There's another way of summarizing it. Also, minor point really, but I really like that in this storyline the X-Men are all wearing these yellow and blue uniforms. They just look cool. Like they've got that a really sort of classic, almost I don't know, it almost reminds me of the animated series of X-Men, even though in that series they wore different outfits. But yeah, it's just got that look to it. I suppose because the animated series was, I think, largely based off the visual style that Jim Lee established. But yeah, anyway, meanwhile, over here we've got X Factor end up going toe-to-toe with Apocalypse in a storyline that centres around Scott Summers' son, Nathan Summers, who is still a baby, I believe, at this point. Yeah, there he is. And they need to try and keep him safe from Apocalypse. That's the gist of what's going on. You know, it's an exciting fight sequence. This Will Spatasio drawing the stuff here. Not as much of a fan of his work. You know, you see, for example, Scott Summers here, Cyclops, looking, that's a bit dubious, you know, like what's going on with the leg down here. That's a very Liefeld style foot, if you ask me. But he's got a bit of a weird style, Will Spatasio. He has this tendency, another one that's sort of difficult to describe, but basically his anatomy looks weird. I suppose that's the simplest way I can put it. It's like he's almost like Jim Lee, but with weirder looking anatomy. And that's by no means saying that Jim Lee's anatomy was perfect, because it's definitely not. But I think it's just better, you know. This is more obviously a bit wrong. And he drew necks in a way where the character almost doesn't have a neck, you know. Quite often, like, these necks are so thick and bizarre looking. I just notice it every time again, you know. I can't not see that ever since I first read through these issues. Again, it's not something that detracts from the story really for me. I can still enjoy it. But yeah, overall, the Spatasio artwork is not that great to me. But what ends up happening here anyway is you get this woman, she just kind of comes out of nowhere and ends up taking the baby, the child, Nathan Summers. Scott's got to give him up in this kind of very difficult moment, obviously, for him. He's got to give his child away and trust in the person he's giving him to, that it's for his best, you know, it's in his best interest to do so. And then ultimately, you know, he gets taken away and becomes Cable. Don't see Cable too much in here though, I think, if at all. But then, so we move into the story arc that ends up being the story that brings everybody back together, the Muir Island saga, which takes place, would you believe it, on Muir Island, which is the home of Moira McTaggart, longtime friend and ally of the X-Men. So there's a crossover with X-Men and X Factor. And it is, yeah, it's fun, you know. It's like not one of the best crossover events, not really an event so much, just a crossover story, really. But all good. So again, you're getting that mix of Spatasio and Jim Lee artwork. Big conclusion here in issue 280. You know, all through this point in time, like I say, it's still building. Like, you know that it's building towards something, and what it's ultimately building towards is the big launch of X-Men #1, which on the one hand was, you know, big and exciting, you know, for Jim Lee fans, I suppose, but bittersweet really, in that it pretty much rang the death bell for Chris Claremont's time on the series. But here, you know, this is it. So you get this final concluding page, Here we've got Charles Xavier kind of thinking aloud to the Beast, Hank McCoy. So what am I going to do with 14 X-Men? So what ended up happening was the team was split into two. We had the X-Men Gold team and the Blue team. With, I think, the Gold team, they carried on in Uncanny X-Men. I think it's the Blue team that moved into just X-Men. So what the book collects here, really cool to do so, is each individual cover of the 4 that made up the different variants available for that particular cover, and then also you get the full image as well, which is really cool. And then so X-Men #1, the big best-selling comic of all time, where we've got Jim Lee co-plotting with Chris Claremont, and this is the first story really with Magneto fully returning to the role of a villain again. This is where we get those kind of costumes all on show that would end up being the animated series costumes for the X-Men. And I think it's, during these issues here, more so than on the Uncanny issues, where Jim Lee really made his presence known. At this point, he's fully into high gear with the quality of his artwork. It just looks really good in here. I mean, to me anyway. If you might disagree, perhaps if you're not as big of a fan, but certainly it's just, it looks really cool. I think Jim Lee's always been helped enormously as well by the inking of Scott Williams, and some extras from the back of this issue here, Villains Gallery, pretty cool. See the Jim Lee version of all these classic X-Men villains. Blast from the past, the original X-Men team and their original costumes, or rather, their original individual costumes. And what would a 90s comic be without a nice swimsuit image? Very cool. Then moving into issue 2. So this whole point, it's Magneto's got his Satellite M, I think it's called, whatever it is. As I say, he's back to being a villain. Rogue kind of comes back and is pleading with him again, just trying desperately to, she's saying like, you this isn't who you are, you're better than this. It's all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't go that way. Back in full villain mode, really. But then, this is kind of what, in a way, really sucks, in my opinion. This is the end of issue 3. What's happened here is the X-Men have, won the day, as you'd expect. Magneto seemingly perishes in a big ball of fire as his space base goes crashing and burning down. But then right here, at the very, very end, CSC, 1976, 1991. So that is the entire sort of tribute. That's the entire thank you that Chris Claremont gets for his incredible run of building and defining this franchise. Whereas ultimately, he was basically just edged out the door by Marvel as they sided with artists over writers, pretty much. So they were giving more control to Jim Lee, to Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, all these artists. They were siding with them. They decided that they were more promising. They were bringing in more readers. It was more important to give them more creative control. Didn't sit right with Claremont, so he ended up having to leave. And the big irony, of course, is that after that, you lose one of your top writers and the guy who redefined this entire series and all these characters. Sided against him with Jim Lee, who, 6 issues later anyway, left the title, left the company, and formed, along with all the other top creators, all the top artists, formed Image Comics, created a new rival publisher. So you have to think that, that's got to be one of the greatest ironies in comics, behind the scenes anyway. Talk about something coming back to bite you. But anyway, so Chris Claremont now gone. Jim Lee still on the book here at this point, obviously. think for the next couple of issues, actually John Byrne, who came back to script. And the big difference, I've mentioned Todd McFarlane already, around this same time that you had this adjectiveless X-Men created for Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane was also doing a very similar thing with Spider-Man. But McFarlane was writing and drawing that himself. He was doing all the writing. And here, Jim Lee seemed to know better and let more accomplished writers, deal with the scripts. And that really worked in this series' benefit. It meant that it just reads better. It's not got that sort of clunky, awkward, almost cringe-worthy dialogue at times that the McFarlane Spider-Man run has. You got John Byrne did a bit of scripting, and then Scott Lobdell, who I'm not saying by any means is one of the all-time excellent writers, but I think he's a better writer all in all than McFarlane is. And yeah, so I said that just works. That's why I would always say that this fairly short run on X-Men of Jim Lee's is more enjoyable to read than the McFarlane Spider-Man run is. So we get Bishop as well. He starts to appear, he joins the team, but the thing is, he had, well, first I've got to mention this panel. Just one of those incredibly memorable pages, I think, seared into the minds of myself and a lot of others. Jim Lee definitely knew what he was doing there. But yeah, so Bishop turns up on the scene, and he's just kind of there, because he'd actually appeared in the Bishop's Crossing story, which you see predominantly in Uncanny X-Men issues, which are not collected here. So there's, collecting X-Men around this era is a bit of a nightmare. For me, I just kind of accept that there's going to be bits I'm just not going to have, because getting a hold of everything, when the oversized hardcovers in particular are all out of print, all very hard to find and super expensive if you do find them. So easier just to read that stuff digitally, I think, when you need to fill in some gaps for the most part. But yeah, so Bishop had turned up in the storyline in Uncanny X-Men, then he just sort of appears here. So when you're reading this book, he just shows up. You just have to sort of accept that he's there. But then you move into this crossover with Ghost Rider, which is a story in New Orleans, pretty much focusing on Gambit and his, some of his backstory being developed there. Featuring the Brood, who at this point have made a few appearances as the creepy alien menaces that they are. Let's say this lasts a couple of different issues that this runs through. Can't actually remember why Ghost Rider specifically is involved in it. It's been a while since I read it. So yeah, then we move on to, we're at the final two issues here. So this is 10 and 11. So this is where there are actually a couple of stories. There's like an A story and a B story in these issues. Jim Lee only doing one of those stories in each. So these last couple of issues are where you've got the material from. So it makes it pretty quick reads. And then issue 11, that being the cover to the standard variant of the Omnibus, which is a cool image, no doubt. But also Jim Lee's final X-Men work and his final ever Marvel work, as far as I'm aware, unless I'm missing something in my mind. But he's been associated with DC for so long now that I'm pretty sure this is the last thing he ever did professionally for Marvel. To this point anyway. I can't see him going back, to be honest, but yeah, bit of cool trivia. And then this ends on, I suppose, like a goodbye, really. A goodbye double page spread from Jim Lee, with just the whole team line up here, just sort of posing, chilling. Really good image, really like that. And then that's the end. There we go. Off we go. And X-Men as a series ran for a long time after this. It did 113 issues before becoming New X-Men when Grant Morrison took over at that point, years after this. And you get a lot of really cool extras. I think probably out of all the omnibus I've got, this is maybe my favourite bonus section of every Marvel omnibus. There's just a lot of really cool stuff in here. Again, it helps to be a Jim Lee fan. I think your opinion as to whether I'm right or wrong about that will depend entirely as how much you think of Jim Lee's work. But there's just so much cool stuff in here. It's like they put more thought. Firstly, there's more of it than bonus sections tend to give you. And that's really cool. Really cool sort of piece by Wolverine and Psylocke. Yeah, there's just more of it in here, and it's just seemingly a better thought out bonus section. That's how it comes across to me anyway, than it often is. Some of these swimsuit pinups. Tell you, Jim Lee enjoyed drawing Psylocke. I think it's safe to say. 275 cover. Some of the other covers in here. These are like recolored versions from other printings. Rogue looking stunning there, back in her quote-unquote outfit from the Savage Land. You know, somehow not even really mentioned how well Jim draw as Wolverine. You know, that Jim Lee Wolverine design. One of the best to ever draw the character, I think. And all these trading cards, you know, all these original trading cards included. You get the front and the back of each card. And there's loads of them, you know, there's just like, this could have all been skipped, you know, if none of this was in here, I don't think people would have been saying, oh, you know, you really should have included the many trading card images. But the fact that they put it all in here anyway was really cool. And yeah, that's that trade paperback cover that they ended up using, you know, shrinking it down for the spine on this book. And the final things that you get in here, I'm not going to like fold these out completely, but you get this really cool fold out image that forms the first issue cover of X-Men. And then there's another one here that's like a poster of all the different characters. And the really good thing about it is on one side it's original colours, and on the other side it's like modernized colours. And it's really cool. But it's quite fiddly, so when you fold it out, if you fold it out completely, it's actually a little bit tricky to put it all back in, I find anyway. But yeah, really cool inclusion, really excellent bonus section, and a really good omnibus overall. The final omnibus that makes up Chris Claremont's run. So if you were focusing specifically on collecting the Claremont run in omnibus format, you know, you'd be starting with Uncanny Volume 1, and this would be the last one that you'd need for that. And yeah, it's a bit of a bittersweet point really in X-Men history, as I've said, because of that. And really, X-Men entered what you could probably describe as a bit of a dark period in its history, following on from the stuff in here. I think the period after Claremont left and then after Jim Lee left as well, X-Men was kind of in no man's land for the first time in a long time, and took a while to really find its direction again. And that mid to late 90s X-Men stuff is really not my favourite era at all. There's a lot of stuff in there that to this day I've actually not read, or I've only read once and probably forgotten it. And then things would pick up again, I would say, a few years after this with the already mentioned New X-Men run and Grant Morrison, which will be another run to talk about another time. But hopefully, you know, this has been a book that's been interesting for you to, you know, to have a look through with me here in this video, and hopefully my thoughts have been somewhat interesting and useful if it's a book that maybe you're thinking of picking up yourself. But yeah, as always, thank you very much for sticking around and watching the video through. I always appreciate the support as always, and I'll be back again soon with another video.